Scarier than The Conjuring, you say? I mean, if you say so. Something like that would have blown the mind of young Keegan. After a night of running around in the woods with my pals, we decided to watch The Conjuring, and I was so unsettled, I had to grab my 3DS and play Fire Emblem Awakening until the residual spookiness receded. So keep that in mind as you watch this video. You might need to hide behind some sort of strategy RPG if you're unprepared. With that on the table, let's get right into the list. The top 5 true stories scarier than The Conjuring. Coming in at number 5, we've got the St. Louis Exorcism. I cast thee out, thou unclean spirit, along with the least encroachment of the wicked enemy and every phantom and diabolical legion. Sounds a lot more intelligent and intentional than the stuff I'm usually saying, right? Well, that's because it's a quote from this particular exorcism. Which exorcism is that, you may ask? What makes this one special and noteworthy? I figured I'd get this one out of the way off top, especially if we're talking about true stories scarier than The Conjuring. This is the exorcism that inspired a movie that began a wave of nationwide hysteria, convinced people it was cursed, and essentially pioneered the demonic possession flick as we know it now. That's right, the St. Louis Exorcism I so vaguely referred to in the title is actually the tale behind The Exorcist. Holy smokes. So, now that we've got the prelude out of the way, let's talk about what makes this story so spooky. It's a wild one, that's for sure. Apparently there was a priest who had just finished up a year at Harvard that had recently returned home. He was hanging out in a residence known as Verhagen Hall where he had heard the most blood-curdling laughter. It was like a mixture between mad screaming and hysterical cackling. This, of course, drew some attention and brought people to check on the person making this noise. Turns out there was a 14-year-old boy behind this horrible cacophony, and thus began a deep investigation. At night, the boy would contort into different nigh impossible shapes and scream out in tongues, making little to no sense and giving off the impression of being possessed by demons. Obscene words, phrases, and images would appear as raised welts on his skin, and at one point an enormous X appeared on his chest. This could be interpreted as the Roman numeral for 10, which led the priests to believe he was taken over by 10 demons. As things got worse and worse for the boy, he started sustaining seemingly psychic injuries. He'd thrash and bleed and do awful things, but his heart rate never seemed to change. This is where that classic vomit scene was born. Apparently the boy would spit foul substances at the attending priests. I wouldn't be too surprised if the 360-degree head spin had roots here too. There were plenty of witnesses during this exorcism, but the whole ordeal has been scrutinized over the years. The details are questionable, but the story remains. It's hard to overlook something so iconic. Coming in at number 4, we've got the Panama Exorcism. Jumping way forward in time, this paranormal occurrence was a big news item in early 2020. This is a truly terrifying tale considering all the human suffering involved. In January of 2020, a large group of bodies was discovered in an indigenous area of Panama, supposedly all the result of a large-scale exorcism. All the victims and suspects were members of a local indigenous community. It seems that a small sect of people had banded together to rid the neighbors of what they considered demons. So there are 2 possibilities here. We've got the chance of a real demonic possession and the idea that it spread to 15 odd people. That is a massive demonic presence, one that folks likely would cower at the sight of. Most possessions seem to limit themselves to a single person, maybe a family at most, but 15 people. I don't know if a Conjuring story would be able to begin covering all of that. Wild. However, there is the alternate tale, one that is just as, if not more, scary. There's the possibility that the sect of people performing these exorcisms weren't looking to rid their neighbors of demons. They could simply have been deluded and looking to cause some harm. When you hear that 15 people were kept locked away from the world, forced to undergo rituals with the pretense of cleansing, you might not immediately think of actual possession. Cult behavior might be more front of mind. While the details of the exorcisms themselves are foggy at best and the true intent of the exorcists may never be known, there is a 100% possibility that this was truly terrifying for all involved. Coming in at number 3, we've got demons in Arkansas. With all sorts of strange ailments culminating in a fall from a second-story window, this tale is complex and full of twists. A nurse with a history of running marathons, Amy Stamantis, was perfectly healthy before her experiences with supposed demons. Then, out of the blue, she started acting strangely. She forgot how to do her job, she couldn't walk in a straight line, she couldn't even pick out her clothes in the morning. It worried the people in her life immensely, but they couldn't figure out what was going on. This behavior intensified over time, turning into things like screaming at former colleagues and disrobing at family events. Doctors couldn't find where this strange behavior was coming from, even though she was going to all sorts of different places to see if anyone could figure it out. The voices in her head proved to be too much, and she found herself falling from a second-story window. Paralyzed and clinging to life, she was ready to give up. Then, during a prayer service for Amy, a Pentecostal evangelist noticed something was off. This woman had performed exorcisms or something similar to exorcisms in the past and claimed to see demons within Amy. She prayed over her and heard a growling from within. That sealed it, and she began an exorcism. Using anointing oils and prayers to God, this evangelist eventually flushed the demons right out of Amy. A happy ending for sure, but could you imagine going through that kind of possession and not knowing what was happening? Coming in number 2, we've got the Winchester House. So get this, the folks who live here are convinced that the ghosts of people killed by the guns they manufactured haunt their house. Making deadly weapons has to weigh heavy on one's conscience, so I suppose this was an inevitability. Still, the amount of supposed ghosts and demons in this house is off the charts, so much so that they had to get really creative with the architecture. At some point, the heir to the Winchester Rifle Company, Sarah Winchester, decided to have a sprawling mansion built. It never seemed to be complete though. She would continuously bring in contractors to build new features and change up the old ones. Apparently, she wanted to confuse the ghosts of people killed by her family's rifles. I guess these ghosts came back with a vengeance at some point and found their way into the family home. So inside, there are plenty of different structures meant to keep the phantoms spiraling. Stairways to nowhere, doors that open into walls, hallways that become labyrinths, and more. An alternate telling of the story has Sarah Winchester doing all of these wacky renovations because she wanted to be an architect. However, I like putting the stories together, where the budding architect has to battle the ghosts that have come back to get revenge for all of the lead pumped into them. The process of figuring out these apparitions were actually returning to the home of the person who started the rifle company that would eventually kill them is a spooky mystery waiting to happen all on its own. But adding in these spooky maze-like features to an old mansion? Tell me you don't want to learn more. And finally, at number 1, we've got the Axe Murder House. Sounds promising, right? Located in Villisca, Iowa, this family home is considered one of the most haunted places in America. Back in the early 20th century, a family was mysteriously hacked to bits here. Someone broke in and chopped them up with an axe. Thus the name, the Villisca Axe Murder House. The culprit was never found, and to this day, nobody really knows what happened here. This story has made for quite a reputation, and those who spend time here will back it up. Visitors claim that there's a dark paranormal power embedded in this house and are often willing to pay out the nose to attempt an overnight stay. More often than not, these visits are cut short. Demonic laughter has been reported, light fixtures have failed and fallen on people, and all sorts of household objects have been flung about. There's even the tale of a paranormal investigator who spent a night there and ended up stabbing himself before his time was through. Be careful and maybe reconsider spending time here. We'll keep telling the spooky stories so that you don't have to go and find out for yourself. Well, unless you want to, but report back, I want details. Well, do you think any of these are true? What about Scarier than the Conjuring? Either way, I had a lot of fun learning about these possessions and hauntings. Ain't nothing quite like a ghost story, right? So, what'd you think of the list? Do you have any stories scarier and truer? Make sure you let me know down in the comments. Speaking of comments, let's take a look at some of your more wonderful ones from the top 5 scariest aquatic SCP monsters you need to read about, part 3. Lord Inquisitor Ignis says, I'll be honest, the sea scares me enough as is without these creatures. Yeah, I'd say that terror is probably the driving force behind the dreaming up of these creatures. Boots the Cat says, love the promo at the end, brother. I had to look up a 10-year-old post to find out what you were talking about, but it was worth it. We love a classic copy pasta, even if it isn't creepy. Zachzilla says, you're starting to look like an 80s hockey player. Now that's what I'm talking about. And Andrew Schur says, I thought Lucy did all the aquatic monster lists because she's so scared of the water. Well, turns out she could only do so many before having a full-out aquatic meltdown. Don't tell her I told you that. And Ajay says, we have a weird case here of Saitama eating too much shrimp and turning into a monster. Well, hopefully he didn't ingest any monster cells along with it. Who knows though? And that is all the time we have for today. I'm going to sit in my car with all the windows up in broad daylight. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. The process of figuring out that these apparitions were actually returning to the home of the person who started the rifle company that would eventually kill them Why did I speak like that? That was like freaking Ben Shapiro nonsense. Speaking of comments, let's take a look at some of your more